Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matthew Taylor. I'm Chief Executive of the RSA, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's RSA online event. It's great to have the chance to talk today to an old friend of mine, John Keane. We worked together about 20 years ago, which was fun. And John, you don't seem to have changed at all in the intervening time. John is Professor of Politics at the University of Sydney and at the WZB Social Science Centre in Berlin, and Director of the Sydney Democracy Network. He's speaking to us from Sydney. John has written and researched widely on democracy. He's written some fantastically important books on democracy and the threats it faces, the future of global institutions, politics of China and the Asia-Pacific region, amongst many other topics. I've been reading over the last few days, I've been completely gripped by his new book, The New Despotism, which explores the anti-democratic practices and tools deployed by governments across the world that threaten the ideals, the customs of power sharing democracy. But his book isn't a simple read if you think you can divide the world up into good guys and bad guys. So, John, how on earth we're going to contain this conversation in 30 minutes is beyond me. But let's just start very briefly by we are in very different positions, John, you and I. I'm in Britain, which has arguably got the worst record, one of the worst records in the world in containing coronavirus and reducing deaths. You're in one of the places in the world that has done it best. Now, given your reflections on democracy and government, why has Australia done so well, and what does that tell us about effective governance?
Matthew, great to talk. The short answer is that those countries, those contexts that suffered or have a record of democracy failure are typically the places where this pestilence has actually ravaged sections of the population and brought a lot of misery to millions of people. At one end of the spectrum is Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, and I think Australia can be added to the mix, where there was very quick action to deal with the pestilence. Borders were locked down, rules were put into place. There was very clear messaging by political leaders, and that actually has improved the level of trust. It's actually reversed a long trend in each of those countries for a decline of trust in politicians. And open government, being honest about the dimensions of the pestilence, what we know and don't know about COVID-19, all of that put together and coordinated government. In Australia, we have the first ever national cabinet. It's a consortium of state premiers, the territory leaders, and the Prime Minister. And of course, there's a lot of open politics in that national cabinet. But the result has been that the society feels, and it's true for the other countries, it feels that they want actually this pestilence to pass. They've demonstrated a great deal of solidarity and trust in government. At the other end of the spectrum, it's very clear, is I'm afraid Britain, and I'm afraid the United States, where we have developing, something like a quadruple crisis, a democracy failure that is, of course, to do with the pestilence, but it's also to do with the stagnation that has been an endemic part of that political economy. A deep disaffection with parties and politics, especially among young people. That's the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. And I would say as well, a decline of the United States. So there's a geopolitical source of this democracy failure where the United States is struggling to come to terms with the emergence of China as a global power. Put all that together with a lot of fake news being circulated from the presidency, now heavy-handed violence, disjunction between states and the federal level. I mean, it's grist to the mill of those in China who say, pointing to the United States, that one would never want a democracy, an electoral democracy of that kind. And that's, I think, one of the misfortunes of this crisis that affects us all. So that's a long-winded answer to try to say, Matthew, that actually democratic accountability in handling crises is really, really important, and there can be equitable resolutions of a crisis. When there's a lack of democratic accountability, then people are pushed aside, and inequality grows. The nastiness of life takes deeper root, and so on.
So one of this puts me in mind of some recurrent themes in your work, John, over the years. So one is that we have to resist simplistic solutions. The world does not line up in a way which makes it easy for us to understand.
Yes.
And I was talking to Michael Ignatieff the other day for a podcast I've been doing around the relationship between crisis and what comes after it. And Ignatieff was saying that Viktor Orban has had a good crisis. So some of the despots have done badly and are doing badly. Things don't look great in India. We don't really know what's going on in Russia because it's hidden away. Bolsonaro's not doing terribly well, but efficient and effective despots seem to have done okay. Erdogan's done well. Orban has done well. So you've got that on the one hand. And on the other hand, exactly as you say, it's not enough just to be a formal democracy where power is exchanged at election times. You have to be a vibrant democracy. So I've heard that Taiwan, for example, one of the reasons it's done so well is because it has a tradition of citizen engagement in technological innovation. And so there wasn't a suspicion there of using things like track and trace because of the relationship the citizens have with their government around technology. Right. And while the situation in America is terrible, it is in some ways mitigated by the fact that it is a relatively decentralized country. And so some mayors and some governors have been able to do something in the absence of federal leadership. So we have to, unfortunately, this crisis doesn't enable us, does it, to line things up in easy ways between the good guys and the bad guys, the systems that we notionally support and the systems that we're worried about.
No, not all cats are grey, and not all dogs are Dalmatians, let's say. There is, of course, to be added, I think, Matthew, the point that the leader of the pack of despotisms, as I describe them in detail in this book, which is an anatomy of how power works in these regimes, the leader of the pack is China. It was the place that hatched the virus. I was actually teaching summer school in Wuhan in the first half of August. It's as if I've been, running away from this pestilence. And I can say that on the ground, the local scholars and journalists and those who are honest would say that this virus was hatched under the conditions of great corruption of power. Local markets protected by racketeers and the local party protected. When the first news of this virus surfaced among the medics, there was, as we know, an attempt to completely silence those medics. And then, so there's an instance of, democratic failure being the source of a crisis and of something that has very long legs and greatly affects people's lives, millions of people's lives. Then the party cracks down, and Wuhan, a city of 12 million, is locked down, and Hubei province is locked down. The party had done nothing because it had 2 meetings in January. It didn't want bad news, and Chinese New Year was coming. But to return to the point, China, the largest and most powerful despotism in my analysis, is now the country that hatched the virus is the first to stand up, while significant parts of the world, in Latin America, in Europe, and in the United States, are down on their knees. So this is a good period for some despotisms, and it's also important to add, I think, that despots some despots are using this crisis to make gains. Of course, we'll see what happens to Bolsonaro, and we'll see what happens to Orban. But if you look at, for example, Serbia, President Vucic, has all the marks of a despot and trying to build a despotism, on the southeast fringes of Europe, and is criticizing the EU and saying that our brothers are in China. There are even Chinese flags in Belgrade. And meanwhile, on the other end, on the democratic end, we have a mixture of records. I've mentioned Taiwan and South Korea and New Zealand and Australia. It's possible to include South Africa in that group, by the way. They have done rather well in containing the pestilence. But the really worrying thing for me is that the largest democracy in terms of power, in terms of political economy, in terms of military force, the third democratic empire in the history of democracy is showing signs of internal decadence. And it's, from the point of view of anybody who considers themselves a Democrat, it's a deeply worrying trend in which there is a breakdown of democratic institutions, and where Washington is leading, I would say, judging by the thinking in terms of the book, that number 45, as I call him, I don't refer to his name anymore. It's my way of being optimistic. With a bit of luck, there'll be a 46th. If you look at what he's done in under 4 years, it's not only the spreading of fake news and toxic, spreading toxic language in public life. And it's not only the demagogy, in the name of the American people and imaginary American people. We know all of that. But it is the taming of Congress, it's the neutering of the judiciary, and it's the running down of accountability mechanisms in the federal bureaucracy. There are still handfuls of states that do not have an American ambassador. This is an empire. But, so what I think, measured in terms of the New Despotism book, is that in the heartlands of democracy, we have some signs, some seriously advanced signs of despotism taking root. And it's happening in the United States. If he's reelected, you can imagine that this degradation of power checking, what I call monitory democracy, will continue. We'll see the degradation of elections. We'll hear much more of this populist talk of the people. There will be targeted violence. The gap between rich and poor will grow, and I suspect that we are going to have intense confrontations from the United States with China. That's a very bleak, dark scenario, and it is described in this book towards the end, where, as you rightly said, to the point, I don't think in black and white terms. They're not good democracies and bad despotisms. There's an entanglement that's part of the confusion of our times and part of the contradictoriness of our moment. But all is not lost, and it does seem to me that there are democracies that are doing well in this crisis that may well activate something like a democratic Green New Deal. Strengthen rule of law, clean up elections, get dark money out of them, generally work on empowerment of citizens, improvement of representation. All of that is possible in this crisis, and we see already signs of that, and we see it also at sub-national levels. Cities, I would say Copenhagen, for instance, are places where there's a lot of democratic experimentation going on. One of the warnings in this book is not to think in black and white or catastrophic terms. The Spanish have a wonderful term for this, fracasomania. Fracasomania is this mentality where you say everything is terrible and therefore everything has to be changed. I'm much more pragmatic, intellectually and politically, and it seems to me that that's the spirit that runs through this book. It's a warning of what is going on in our world. It's a warning that democracies can actually be snuffed out by despotic power. But it is a call for cleaning up the Augean stables. You know, King Augeas, I think he had 3,000 oxen, and he didn't clean the stables for 30 years. And it took a Hercules, you know, to clean out, well, those stables. It does seem to me a lot of cleaning up of democracies is now on the agenda. This is the moment, because this is probably as great a crisis of democracy as we've seen since the 1920s and 30s. And we are lucky. For the moment, there are no Mussolinis and Hitlers. There are no Stalins. There is a China, but it's of a different character as a polity. So this crisis is one in which democracies are suffering, and they're going to have to come to terms with the new China.
I mean, you wrote the book before the crisis, but
I did.
But absolutely, it isn't in any way, I don't think, aged by the crisis. Because what I took from your argument, in essence, was that in the kind of battle between despotic and democratic regimes, that we needed to understand, firstly, that despotism was much more robust and effective in its most effective forms than we might like to imagine, and that the complacency that said, well, despotism will always collapse under the weight of its own contradictions is misplaced.
Correct.
On the other hand, the notion that there is something uncomplicated called democracy that we can extol misses out the fact that the kind of state that democracy has reached in America or in other notionally democratic regimes. And after all, many of these despotic leaders were elected. You know, Bolsonaro was elected and is now trying to, despotism has come out of democracy, which is one of the points that you make. And so this is, as you say, this crisis, it comes at a time when these models are fighting it out. And I completely agree with you, to use another phrase, that democracy is like a bicycle. If it's not going forward, it's liable to fall over.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in your view about what is it that we need to be doing with democracy if it is going to live up to what it's supposed to be, which is in the end the strongest thing it can do. Because one of the other things you want to argue in the book is don't believe that you can defeat despotism through violence. Yeah. In the end, even if it sounds pious, what democracy has to do is just be a much better system. Because in the end, if you genuinely have a much better system, you can hope that the people who live in despotic regimes will eventually say, we want that system, which is in part how democracy spread. So what is it we need to do to our democracies in order that they can once again look like a system that people in despotic regimes would aspire to?
You've summarized beautifully the book. And I don't have much more to add. I'm joking. I think there are two things there, Matthew. One is your point, which I do elaborate at length in this book, that these despotisms are not tin pot dictatorships. Mugabe's Zimbabwe, violent, anarchic, riddled with arrogance. They are not fascist. Actually, these despotisms prefer that the bulk of the population, the middle classes, for example, are locked down in private pursuits, in career, in shopping, in household life. Under Erdogan, the number of shopping malls has increased 8 times in less than 20 years. They are not dictatorships of the Latin American kind. They're not autocracies in the sense of, a single ruler. Karen Darwishar, who is a Russian politics scholar, has spoken about Putinism as kleptocracy. I think this is also mistaken, because the point is that these despotisms, and certainly the most sophisticated of them, are very well aware about the dangers of abuse of power. They have a whole toolbox to try to win the loyalty of important parts of the population. Voluntary servitude is their thing. And one way they do that is actually to build learning mechanisms into the structures of power. Probably the pathbreakers are the Singaporeans. They've had this REACH program since the 1980s, and they do things like tea sessions and meetings with stakeholders. The UAE has a happiness program, with happiness public forums embedded into the system to find out why it is that people are unhappy. All of them rely on public opinion polling agencies. They, of course, all use elections with a couple of exceptions. All of them have think tanks. So they are smart forms of power. And the first recommendation from this book, in reply to your question, is we should get to know them better. We need better to understand them. We need certainly to give up the presumption that a good economic crisis will finish them off, or maybe some saber rattling, or maybe some diplomatic pressure will bring them tumbling to the ground. I think that's a misjudgment, and so that's a first priority. The second has to do with the turbulence and the disaffection, the ressentiment that's clearly taken root in democracies, and it's been coming for quite some time. The disaffection with political parties. Young people don't join. The Corbyn phenomena was a passing moment, I think. The growing gap between rich and poor. The degradation of public life. The sense among millions of citizens that their representatives don't represent them properly. And then in civil society, the continuing bullying of women by men, #MeToo. And there is, of course, a whole bundle of ecological problems. All of these have taken the wind out of the sails of actually existing democracies. And so this crisis comes in one way as a culmination of that trend and a reinforcement of that trend. And it therefore, third point, is it raises the question, it puts on the table the question of why is it that we should hang on to the ethos, the language, the institutions of democracy, and what do we actually mean by democracy? Well, in my work, I had a sad life. I did nothing else but write about the past and present and future of democracy. In my work, I've tried to say that in my generation, a sea change happened in the meaning of democracy. It was, once upon a time, for my grandparents and great-grandparents, it meant free and fair elections, with a constitution and, of course, a free press. But the central nervous system, if you like, of democracy was elections. In my work, I've tried to show that beginning in the late 40s, and I think accelerating into our times, this model of democracy, this understanding of democracy has changed, is changing. We don't properly recognize it. We didn't properly have a name for it. I don't want to call it liberal democracy. I think that's too, it always sounds, it's liberal democracy. It always has an American accent. India is not a liberal democracy. Taiwan is not a liberal democracy. What I think the sea change is that democracy means nothing less than free and fair, uncorrupted elections, but something much more. And the something much more is the checking and balancing the public scrutiny of power to prevent its abuse wherever it happens. So whether that's in the field of corporate power, or whether it's in the field of NGOs, or whether it's in the field of government. I call this monitory democracy. The public monitoring of power is very, very important. Why is it a good thing? Well, in my work, I've tried to write a history of justifications of democracy. And it might sound strange to say this, Matthew, but more than 90% of them are just exhausted, worn out, or just risible. For instance, if you go back to classical Greece, to Athens, the main justification for democracy was that it made that democracy, it was an imperial democracy, militarily great. This is weird. Or if you jump forward in time to, say, the anti-slavery movement, it's the first big social movement of modern times, and you look, as I've done, at the pamphlets written by Democrats, they tell you that democracy is a God-given ideal. And when you turn the pages, you see it's a Protestant God, which is very bad news for Muslims and for Catholics and for Jews and for Hindus and Jains and so on. I do think that there is, in my work, I've tried to develop this, to finesse it, to say it in many different ways. I think there is one 21st century justification of democracy, which is a little bit Churchillian. You know, Churchill gave this grumpy speech in the House of Commons saying, you know, it's the least worst form of government. You know, it doesn't bring peace on earth, and it doesn't turn us into angels, but it's the best we've so far invented. There is some truth in that, except he was thinking about elections and parliamentary rule. I think the 21st century version of it goes something like this, that the best thing about democracy, the key reason why we must not lose it, that its spirit must not die, that it not be destroyed by growing gaps between rich and poor, by the corruption of public language, by the infusion of dark money into institutions, that the key reason why it's important is that it is the best weapon we have so far invented for preventing the abuse of power and often the great evils that come from the hubris that comes from accumulations of unaccountable power.
So John, because we've nearly run out of time, and which is very frustrating, but I want to ask you, so I absolutely understand this point, and I absolutely understand the relevance of your concept of monetary democracy in relation to despotic regimes, because in a sense, despotic regimes, in the end, however clever and sophisticated they are about concentrating power in an unaccountable way, and democracies, therefore, you're positing as an alternative that we should understand democracies fundamentally as a way of holding power to account.
Yes.
But, and you've got like 5 minutes at maximum to answer this question. Isn't there also, shouldn't we also have more ambition as democracy, going back to those Greek origins, as being a place where decisions are made? And it seems to me that the two critical things are firstly devolving more power, because it is at the local level that we can genuinely involve citizens and they can get close enough to issues to be able to explore trade-offs, and they are themselves implicated in those decisions. When decisions are made locally, we are part of the decision. We have to live out the decision in a way which we don't when it comes to kind of national or federal policy. And then secondly, I am a great champion of deliberative methodologies and the growth of deliberative democracy, not as an alternative to representative democracy, but as a way of addressing the legitimacy deficit in representative democracy. And demonstrating the capacity of citizens to be able to understand issues that are quite complex in a sophisticated way and come up with great ideas. So I want to add to your monetary democracy the fact that through devolving power and through deliberation, we can also bring back elements of that Athenian model of citizens themselves being involved in the decision-making. Now, in your remaining 3 minutes, tell me whether or not that is part of the way in which we deal with the battle that you describe in your most recent book.
Yeah, I think there is no doubt about your points. And for example, you've written, Matthew, about and have made a call for a citizens' convention. of the kind that transformed abortion law in Ireland, that legalized LGBTI rights and brought a measure of civility to daily life where previously there wasn't. So all I think, and it's a great deal that you're saying, is that you are describing, in other words, what I'm also talking about when I refer to monitory democracy. You know, if you look at the inventions for handling power and involving citizens in the last generation, from the end of the 40s, I count over 100 new institutions that never existed before in the history of democracy. So we don't need to go back to the Greeks because we have inventions like participatory budgeting. We have truth commissions. We have deliberative democratic experiments. We have public forums. And I think that the democratic agenda hereon in this crisis is one in which, to repeat, free and fair elections remain really, really important. And that means the reinvention of parties and a new genre, a new generation of uncorrupted leaders who have the capacity to motivate citizens and so on. Changing electoral laws, but as well building up these institutions to deal with the policy challenges that are now on the agenda. If you're going to green a city, you can't do it technocratically, or if you try to do that, you will produce disaffection, and you will likely, if I'm right about the dangers of abuse of power, you're likely to get things wrong. So democracy is a learning process. Monitory democracy is a complicated learning process. And of course, it produces a profusion of voices, often a cacophony. But that's what democracy is, and it is a clear alternative to these despotisms, ultimately whose weakness is, despite all of the learning mechanisms they institutionalize, they cannot allow a free press. They cannot allow open public scrutiny of what I call polygarchs, those who run the system from on high. And the manifestation of that is this great pestilence. If you look at the hatching of this virus, it is a textbook case of a pestilence spreading with a great global disruption because of the absence of public monitoring and scrutiny and citizen involvement in power. And if you want to look at the alternative, look at little Taiwan. 23 million people, very few deaths. Life continued to be normal until today. Its economy will again rise quite quickly. And there was no emergency rule. There was no clampdown on social freedoms. That's a sign of a democracy which is more than free and fair elections. It's a sign of a democracy where there is this sense among the population and those who are leaders that being accountable, being open to scrutiny, is really important for producing a social solidarity, for ensuring that power is not abused with sometimes evil effects. That's my vision, briefly.
Well, it's great that we've ended up with that positive example of Taiwan. And indeed, I'm speaking to one of the leading figures in developing that Taiwan strategy on my podcast later this week. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. John, thank you for taking the time to talk to me, for alerting us to the nature of the choices that we face, the things that are going to play out after every major crisis. Then sometimes democracies emerge strengthened and sometimes they emerge weakened. So these are enormous issues, and I can highly recommend John's new book, The New Despotism, which is a roller coaster. People use that phrase, but it really is a roller coaster ride because it's both exhilarating and terrifying. So I encourage you to read it. And if you have read it, you will at least avoid being simplistic about the different systems that we see around the world. Do please keep up with the RSA's channels for updates on further conversations, as well as fresh insights from our policy research team and news from our growing global fellowship. But finally, thank you again to John Keane for joining us, and thank you all for watching.